All right. DJJ's been my whole career, so I never expected that to be the case. I moved to California to get my degree in forensic psychology, my doctorate in forensic psychology. And as a part of that, you have to do a practicum placement. And at the time, my choices were between going to an adult prison because of the forensic piece of it, or going to CYA at the time, the California Youth Authority. I've always loved working with kids, so I picked that over the adult. Went in, wanted to just get my practicum placement, had a completely different path tracked out in my head for where I would end up. So I started working there in 1999. I was at the Chad site. At the time, there was over 1,000 youth there. My primary supervisor was the one psychologist for all the youth on what we called General Pop at the time, which was about over 800 youth that he was in charge of working with. And what I loved about the experience was I was put into the kind of like jumping into the fire. So I was able to do psychological assessments. I was able to meet with youth individually, was getting much more experience than some of my colleagues in their different practicum placements. And I started working with the youth, and I fell in love with the work. These were youth that could be difficult, but were witty, were incredibly smart, had backgrounds that broke my heart. I could see their desire just to connect with people. I could see their desire to have a good life. And I recognized that this moment, this facility, this work was their shot to turn it all around. And so I used to tell folks as I started getting more and more into this is what I want to do, why would you want to work with that population? I really felt like they had fallen through so many other systems, that these were the kids that the world threw away, and someone needed to step up to care for them. And it was a team. I saw staff that were really dedicated to working with the youth. At the time, we didn't have very many resources. They didn't have very many resources. I enjoyed the partnership with them. I enjoyed the collaboration with the psychological colleagues that I had. And so I was very lucky and able to, once my practicum placement was finalized, was able to get into a internship program that was through, at the time, a federally funded substance abuse program. So I moved from Chad over to OH and was able to work 20 hours a week through that grant on Butte Hall, it was at the time. And that was even a more amazing experience, in part because of Alicia Ginn was there at the time. And she was so dedicated to that program and was open to exploring different things, like what could we do with this grant to really make this impactful. So she and I worked on creating a family counseling program for Butte Hall. We had a weekend where we would get parents together of youth that were getting ready to go home, and we'd invite them. She'd talk through, kind of what all the steps were, things that they needed to think about when their child comes home to them, all the work that they've been working on to try to bridge that gap. And then I offered family counseling as part of that transition. So then my following, after that meeting and then every other subsequent weekend, I would go and have family counseling sessions. I loved that piece. That was so rewarding, I think, is probably the best word to use, because I got to see growth not only from the youth, but from the families. And it was a wide variety. Some families, we just get ready to make sure they knew the educational piece of it. Some families I was so amazed with their willingness to dig into really difficult topics that, had they not talked about, I think would be a challenge to then have that reunification once the youth left. So loved that ability. Again, wanted to be able to stay. The superintendent at the time at OH, as that internship was ending, he was able to figure out a way for me to continue my work there as I finished with graduate school, which I was incredibly grateful for. And then I did my postdoc hours as a psychologist, and then got my first official job after I was done with graduate school in 2003 as a clinical psychologist. My intent was to just stay as a psychologist. I loved working with the youth. And here again, life is funny. You never know quite where it's going to take you. I knew I wanted to stay with, I think it had just started to switch to DJJ, but I wanted to stay there. And the only psychologist position that was available when I finished graduate school was on the sex offender unit, Humboldt. So if I were to step back to, if you were to ask my 1999 self as I was starting this, what I wanted to, if there were two things I knew I didn't want to do in life, it was working in a facility like that and working with sex offenders. So I'd already changed with the facility piece, and here I was on a unit, and again, my goal was, I get in and then I will have an opportunity to go elsewhere. And then similarly, you fall in love with the work. I think I gained a new perspective for the label versus the human. And I was afraid of the label. But you sit in those groups and you hear those kids talk about their lives, and not that what they did is it's horrible, and it traumatizes the victims. It's an incredibly emotional, physical offense that does have cycles and cycles of harm. But they're not monsters. And that's, I think, what became so clear to me. And at the time, that's when the field was really switching from, as a treatment model, you look at this like once a sex offender, always a sex offender. So treat them, or you've got to get tough with them. You've got to break them down to make sure they're treated. And started switching to, with juveniles, the reoffense rates were always very low, and that these are kids that are in the process of changing. So you can't look at them like they're static. And so had an opportunity to really explore that. The program administrator at the time, Rosa Rivera, I loved her. She's probably one of my big mentors. And Dr. Dietzen, who was my supervisor throughout my entire career, those two together were my great mentors. Dr. Dietzen was my psychological kind of guiding force. And Rosa Rivera, I don't think I'd be in this position without her. She always told me I could be, that I could take other positions than just the psychological positions, that she saw me capable of more broader things, of program things. And so because of that, she was asked when the Farrell lawsuit was just starting, she was asked to take on, lead the development of the tool, the audit tool for the sex offender programs. And so she dragged me to headquarters with her to help her work on that. That led to me taking over the SBTP coordinator position at headquarters in 2008, which allowed me to be a part of developing the sexual behavior treatment program that we have today. That was about 10 years of my life putting that together in that position, which allowed me to then move to the Associate Director of Mental Health and help with the mental health dissent decree. We got out of the SBTP portion of Farrell at 100% compliance, which was an amazing feat. I was proud to be a part of that. And so then moved on to mental health, which allowed me to have an opportunity to become the Deputy Director of Operations. I was very grateful for that opportunity, given my background. I didn't come up through the peace officer ranks. Did become a peace officer because of that, and then which led me to director. I think we've talked about that Farrell touches on everything that DJJ does, and so when asked, how do you describe the change? It was it was huge. I will say, I don't want to take away from the staff that were working tirelessly before Feral. What Feral helped us do was a number of different things that led to this massive amount of change. One, it recognized if you want to rehabilitate, that takes more resources. We had a lot of youth, not a lot of staff, and not a lot of resources. So it is hard to rehabilitate. Like many of us in the 90s, many institutions, you lost your way with the word super predator, the belief that folks can't change, that juveniles can't change. So what Feral allowed us to do is to get back into our roots and also make sure we had the right programming to really affect change. One of the things that was really hard before Feral, particularly in my role as a psychologist, is we just didn't have enough resources to have the programs that we needed for youth that were mentally ill. And so we had big waiting lists. So we had youth who were on what we call our general pop, who were overwhelmed with the stimuli around them, who may have been experiencing psychosis. And it wasn't that people didn't want to help. There were no resources to give, which, so I was working individually with a lot of those youth, just feeling like, God, we need to do better. At the time, youth were allowed to max out, which means there was no supervision for them. So they left with $50 and walked out the gate. I had a youth who was talking to me during that time. He had no family. He had nowhere to go. No other resources but the $50 that was in his pocket. And I remember distinctly, he was such a brilliant artist. So he had, there were so many skills that he could use in a very positive way. But he was talking to me about, his plans. We were working through, okay, when the day comes, let's talk through what this looks like for you. And he said, well, I have nowhere to live. So I know if I take this $50 to this corner in Stockton, I can turn that around for enough money to get a hotel room and some food for at least a week. And not that that's a good decision, but yet it's a decision. It's like, what else could I tell him to do? So I knew there were things that if we had the resources and more staffing, we could help. So I think with Feral, that's the biggest change. We were able to use an assessment tool to recognize how to individualize a treatment plan. It's not a one-size-fits-all for adolescents. So really, what do we target to make sure they can be successful? That we have the mental health programs and level of care that we need so that we don't have youth sitting waiting for a resource that they need right now. We were able to put the sexual behavior treatment program together that changed that belief of, that using a model that doesn't work with this population, to getting interventions that specifically tie to the skills that need to be developed to reduce that risk that we've identified in that individual assessment, to working together as a team to have the same common language. I think another really important thing that came from Feral is one case plan, that we're all working from the same. One of the great things about DJJ is we have a wide variety of staff. We have a school district, so we have school psychologists, we have teachers, we have resource teachers, we have mental health, so we have psychologists, we have doctors that are dealing, if we have a youth with a medical issue, we've got that. We've got youth correctional counselors, we have parole agents. It's great when we're working as a team. If you were to go before Feral and ask a youth what they're working on, they had a different case plan, a different treatment plan for each of the people they were talking to. So as an adolescent, it's like, what are you working on? I don't know. So to be able to target that and work together from the same page, I think was huge.
So I guess that's what we now call the integrated behavioral treatment model?
Yes.
And so do you think that will be sort of a lasting legacy of DJJ?
I hope so. Yeah. I think, it was a recognition that to really help the youth become a healthy person, you have to take a very holistic approach, which means you just can't give them an intervention to deal with their anger, and that's it. You need to reinforce that behavior. You need to have everyone talking that same language. You need to give them extra help and support if they need it, if they have a mental health issue, if they have an ADA compliance issue that makes it difficult for them to learn in a specific way. Well, let's accommodate that. So I do hope that that's the legacy, is recognizing we created a very all-encompassing collaborative model that's very difficult to do in this type of environment. I think one of the biggest lessons we learned in Feral is, again, the collaboration between all the groups. So it's really recognizing the need for that collaboration, recognizing, and I think each area needs to recognize what we do is important, but not any more important than any other part of that team. And then work together to figure out how each component can promote the success of that collaboration. For a long time in Feral, we had these different remedial plans working separately to try to get through each of the items. Well, that doesn't work, because then I'm creating something for the SBTP which conflicts with what the education team needs to do, which conflicts with what we're trying to do with safety and security. So that, I think, would be my best advice, is it starts with collaboration and then you sort out the details. I have a couple of individual youth that I'll never forget, and watching them grow, I think personally, that's one of the biggest things. Like, that made everything worth it. All the hard days, all of the, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can do this, those moments are like, yes, this is why we do this work. And then I think it's the SBTP program. That was, it was a lot of work. There were some pitfalls, there were some starts and stops. There were some times where it's like, oh my gosh, I don't know if we can pull all of this together. But I think what I want to stress and why that was so important is, as the SBTP coordinator, the thing that I love the most about that position is I got to work with all the units, and we pulled together what we called the Sex Behavior Treatment Task Force together, which included mental health and the kind of security supervisors, the program administrators, and we worked together as a team to implement this. And we couldn't have done this if we didn't do that, which, you know, can be a challenge. You've got folks that are coming from different perspectives. So what always amazed me is the work that group did to put forth what we needed to put forth to really get it implemented. The teams, each of those units being willing to be voices. I would go and make sure to meet with them, you know, what's working, what's not working, what do we need to change, what do you like, what you don't like. We talk to the youth, what do you like, what you don't like. So it was so many people were involved in making that successful. I'm very appreciative that people bring my name up a lot around that program, but it wasn't just me. It was, if I didn't have the dedication of the staff that I did, and being able to work with those units and watch it grow and watch it develop and watch it be successful, I'll always be proud of what we were able to accomplish. I think that's part of, you know, falling in love with the work is one thing, but it's the environment that makes all the difference. You know, when I started at DJJ and moved to OH particularly, all the staff there, they're walking around going, we're kid workers. That's our job. We're kid workers. I think that mindset says a lot. So if people are there because they believe in the work that they're doing, then it kind of gives the energy that it needs to give to have ideas and generate, you know, conversations and think outside of the box. You know, in fact, I think that was one of the struggles we had somewhat during Feral was because we were under consent decree, to some extent, some of that creativity needed to be put into a box so we could have the consistency across, which frustrated some of our staff because they wanted to do kind of, create programs. So then it's finding the areas where we can do that. But I agree 100%. And I think that's also what created what we call the DJJ CYA family. We're a family. Folks talk about that a lot too. There's close friendships between the staff. You become, the people that you can go to for support, that understand the difficulty of the work, that are there for each other. There's a support there that I think is unique. It's also why you see people spend their whole careers at DJJ, even if that means they've reached a max level. It's not like, well, I want to go somewhere else so I can get even higher. It's like, no, I want to stay with DJJ, so I'm content. I hope it will be remembered for all the lives that the various programs and the various staff throughout the decades and decades of work that they did helped. No system's ever perfect. All systems can improve. Were there times that DJJ lost their way? Yeah, but I don't think that should be how DJJ is remembered. I think DJJ should be remembered for teaching kids how to milk cows when we first started things like Paso. The pictures of taking youth fishing that we were able to do in the 70s. We were nationally known in the 70s and 80s. That we overcame the challenges that the 90s brought and the mindset, and we changed the whole system. When you look at class action lawsuits for prison-like environments, the amount of work that we were able to do in the time that we did it was amazing. That means you're having people row in the same direction across the state. In the state of California is big. So I hope we're remembered for our successes. I hope we're remembered for the mission that we're caring for kids and that we did. I'll say, I will never regret that this was so far, all of my career will be always the majority of my career. I'll be forever grateful for the opportunities that I was given, for the growth I was able to achieve professionally because of it, and just the lessons. I learned so much from the kids that I worked with, just in terms of courage and strength and resiliency, and I'll take those with me every day. The last 4 years of DJJ, we've had challenging times in DJJ, but I'd like to acknowledge that the last 4 years in DJJ has been incredibly challenging because of all the changes. That we really haven't, because of change, it's hard to get your feet under you. It was, so I want to acknowledge, and I'm bringing it up because I want to acknowledge again, I think this shows the dedication of our staff, that it's hard, everyone's has struggles with change, but when it was announced we were going to become a new department, that's scary. There was it was an important announcement. There's some excitement around it, but there's also anxiety, because it's a big change. So we were right in the midst of putting those pieces together and being able to show folks, here's what this is going to look like, to ease some of those anxieties when COVID hit. And I think COVID affected, as we all know, changed everything in this world. It stopped the world. We had to be very quick to, at headquarters, we went, one day we were all here to one day we were all working from home. And the challenge that the facilities had to take to how do you keep keeping the kids healthy, keeping the staff healthy, keeping the kids engaged in stuff, recognizing that we can't just isolate, kids. We have to, so all those meetings and conversations around how do we do this in a way where people aren't getting sick, something we've never had to face before. And then in the midst of all of that, hearing the news that DJJ would ultimately close and things would be realigned, I just have to thank all the staff and my team, because I couldn't be the director during this time if not for them. And so I just need to acknowledge that, because it's been a tremendous hill to climb, and people climbed it with us to hang on to the end to make sure we could care for the kids. I will say here again is where I get impressed with the character of the DJJ staff, is that when we were first going out and talking about what this might mean for people and their futures and their careers, and which affects their families. And so these are big life altering situations. As many questions as we got from staff on what does this mean for me, it would be quickly followed up with, what does this mean for the youth? Who's going to care for these kids? Who's going to care for the youth? I think that's a powerful statement to what matters to this team as a mission. So I just have to acknowledge that and thank them. I remember, so this is the age group where if someone has a psychological break, if it's often in early 20s, could be late teens. So we've got them at a very fragile time. And I was working with a youth where that's ultimately what happened. He started experiencing some symptoms of psychosis, and it was not something that had been previously in his history. And so as a psychologist, it's one of those things that it's always a challenge to, how do you help someone work through this? So, and I think what's sometimes important in this work is to not get caught up in just like, we got to do this, we got to do this. It's remembering the humans behind what you're trying to accomplish. And I think, so and the reason that I say that is these are one of those moments where I keep in my mind, because it reminds me of the human that we're dealing with. So he was really struggling with some paranoid thoughts, and he was just in this moment of crisis, and it's hard to describe the strange piece, but you could tell there were things going on in his head that was affecting his ability to listen to me. And then there was this moment where he put his head down, and it was almost like for that moment, things were quiet. And he just looked up at me with the biggest kind of tears in his eyes, and he just looked at me and he said, "I don't understand what's happening." And then put his head down again, and then again it's like things got loud again. But it's that moment that I hold on to, because it reminds me again of the human, that he was behaving in ways that were difficult for staff, that were difficult for youth to understand. But he was just trying to understand what was happening. So I hold on to that moment. I remember, and this is one that sometimes in this field, you sometimes have to laugh at dark material, because it's just how it goes. So when I started the family counseling program, that's a tough thing to do, family counseling. You're dealing with multiple different kind of emotions and things going on. I was still very young in my career, so relied on supervision and still gaining those first experiences. And so one of my very first, it was very early in starting this family counseling. So it's on a Saturday, which means, there's staff there, but it's not like my supervisor's there. Could call them anytime, but I'd met with this family a couple of times. It was going really, really well. The youth was getting ready to go home. We had about 10 minutes left in session, which is always the danger time for something to come up inevitably that you're like, oh, well, we can't wrap this up in 10 minutes. And so I remember there was a mother and the daughter, and the son was the client who was at DJJ. And the mother and the daughter started looking at each other as we're getting ready to wrap up. I'm like, okay, so next section we'll talk about this. And they're like, we think this is going really well. We should tell him today. And they're looking at each other. I'm like, what are we telling him? yeah, we should let him know today. This is a good moment to let him know. And I'm of course then getting nervous as the young psychologist going, wait, what? Like, please don't bring up something we can't handle. And it was. So it was, he was always told that his dad had died in an accident, and that wasn't the case. So they were going to tell him, they blurted out the real story right then, which was not a good story, but it was, again, inevitably one of those situations where, oh, now I'm responsible for putting this together. And we have 5 minutes left before my next family comes. Okay. But you get through it. And like I said, it's a dark moment. I mean, in that moment, it was really scary. But at the end, you just kind of laugh of course that happens. And how do you, again, it was a teachable moment. It was a learning moment. I did some things to make sure we didn't get into that. But that sticks out in my head, too, of, oh, my God, these are big experiences that I'm responsible to help put people together for. Since we did family counseling during visiting, then I was able to, and luckily this was earlier in the day, so I was able to delay my next session, and then we had to very quickly kind of work through what those emotions were about. I met with the youth later on in the day to make sure he was doing okay. We did some resources to make sure, I connected the family with some resources to make sure they can work through that, and then we came up with a plan for how we'll next step discuss it in our follow-up session. So, but
expect the unexpected.
Expect the unexpected, and usually right before you're wanting to close the session.